Everyone can kind of see my screen. All right, I get a thumbs up. So again, I'm Pete Slominski with the Maine Geological Survey. I'm going to be sharing with you some information on a project that we have undertaken with the other four New England, well, all five New England states throughout the Northeast. And one of the goals of our project was we wanted to design, permit, install, and monitor low-cost, transferable living shoreline approaches that reuse natural materials in Casco Bay. And two materials that we have quite a bit of, or at least are getting a lot of, is used oyster shell and also trees. There are a lot of trees on the islands and along the mainland in Casco Bay on unstable bluffs that are falling over all over the place. So there's no lack of trees as well. So we wanted to use those in a demonstration treatment and then monitor those for a period of time. So I'm going to give you a summary as to what sites we selected, what designs we kind of decided to come up with in terms of the locations, and then share with you a status update as to what's going on. So to start things out, we went through a whole process of picking a bunch of sites. We wanted to look for sites that had either a eroding bluff or an eroding marsh toe, two things that are representative of the issues that we see in Casco Bay that property owners and municipalities are concerned about. We wanted to have the sites that we selected be representative of a larger geography or the larger region. They had to be owned by a project partner. We didn't want to go and try to get MOAs or MOUs with a variety of different property owners as part of this project. We had to have relative easy or representative site access. And what I mean by representative is there are a lot of islands in Casco Bay. So just to get a sense of how to do one of these projects on an island, we picked an island site. The other two sites are on the mainland. We wanted a relatively straight or consistent shoreline type of 150 feet or more so we could have natural controls on both sides. We wanted to have an appropriate MGS living shoreline suitability score, and I'll get into that in a second, and then of course educational and public opportunities associated with the sites. So we narrowed our entire list down to 3 sites. 2 were located in the town of Brunswick in the upper end of Casco Bay and McQuaid Bay. Wharton Point and McQuaid Bay Conservation Lands. Wharton Point is owned by Inland Fisheries and Wildlife and the town of Brunswick. And McQuaid Bay Conservation Lands is owned by Brunswick Topsom Land Trust and the town of Brunswick. And our island site that we selected is owned by Maine Coast Heritage Trust, which is Lanes Island, which is just off the mouth of the Royal River, across from Cousins Island. It's an uninhabited island. So I mentioned our MGS Living Shoreline Suitability Tool. This is a tool that we've developed for Casco Bay only at this point, which looks at a variety of different factors that influence the suitability of whether a site is suitable or not for a potential living shoreline project. And we basically scored all of these, every 150 feet, there's a point. You can see these points all along the coastline here. And those points are a summation of a variety of different characteristics that we assigned weighted scores to. So our highest score is highly suitable with a range of 36 to 44. So Wharton Point came in at moderately to highly suitable with scores of 35 to 37 along the project site out of 44. This is what the site actually looks like. It's a small 50-foot segment of a larger eroding coastal wetland. There is a log that's washed into the marsh. I'll explain to you why we chose to have this where the log is. So we're only looking at about a 50-foot treatment on a relatively large marsh edge. Our second site, McQuaid Bay Conservation Lands in Brunswick, scored highly suitable with a score of 37 to 41 out of 44. So it's in that higher range even than Wharton Point. It is on the end of about a 20-minute hike or a quick airboat ride from Wharton Point. And this is what that site looks like. Again, we had an eroding marsh edge. You can see these slump blocks that have slumped down, which is representative of a lot of fringe marshes in Casco Bay, and a 50-foot section along a much larger stretch of eroding salt marsh. Our third site was Lanes Island, and this one's very, very different. It's an eroding coastal bluff. It scored on the low end of moderately suitable, so 30 to 31 out of 44. And as you can tell on this scoring system here, it's just next to an area that we would consider to be possibly or not very suitable, where the yellow is. So these are kind of a stoplight approaches: red, yellow, green. So this is a test site we wanted to test for a coastal bluff. It's owned by a project partner, and it's on the low end of that moderately suitable scale. This is kind of what it looks like. There's a long stretch of eroding coastal bluff, about 10 to 12 feet in height. And lots of downed trees. So we had trees on site that we wanted to use. So we're kind of going to get into some of the challenges, solutions, and initial lessons learned at the end. One of the first challenges that we encountered as we started this project was the regulatory agencies from the state to the federal level were very concerned about the traditional use of degradable plastics in the environment. So we talked about using oyster shell. One of the traditional ways of doing that is to take very, very, very light plastic clam netting. You can see how thin the netting is here. Fill it with oyster shell and put it out to create a little kind of sill or a little breakwater at the edge of a marsh to kind of help break up waves or slow down erosion. This is something that immediately raised concerns with the regulatory community because these plastics break down very, very quickly. These bags tear very quickly, and then these plastics become smaller pieces of plastics in our marine environment. So that's something we had to address right away. We couldn't just go out and throw these bags out there. One of the other challenges that we have in Maine, and more so than the rest of New England, is the accounting for the impacts of ice. These are our two Brunswick sites this is in February of last year. And you can see there's big rafts of ice which gouge away at the marsh and drive up over the edge of the marsh. We don't have icing so much as an issue at the Lanes Island site just because of the tidal currents and the area adjacent to the Royal River Channel. So what was our solution? Well, we went out and looked for biodegradable products which we thought would be heavy enough to be able to withstand our icing and also withstand some waves. And we couldn't find anything out there at all. A lot of living shorelines constructed in the mid-Atlantic and southeastern states use just typical coir fiber, coconut fiber logs that they put out that fall apart within a month. But they have such high colonization rates of oysters and things that it's okay if those shells fall out. The oysters will still colonize to create kind of a reef. We don't know if that's going to happen in Maine, so we wanted something that's going to last longer. So we worked with BMT Fibers and EJP to develop a custom bag that we had made for us by BMT Fibers, which is made with this very, very, very heavy coconut fiber weave that's reinforced. And then it's 12 inches by 24 inches, weighs about 25 pounds. So it's pretty easy for somebody to move, whether you're a homeowner, whether you're a volunteer, by hand. The other thing we wanted to test is we still wanted to test some kind of plastic product. So what we did is we went out and we worked with a supplier, Tensar. They have this new product out there that's made of highly UV and abrasion resistant plastic, which is what they're calling a georeef. It assembles by hand. You can see one folded up in the wheelbarrow, but you unfold it, kind of run these little bars through it, and then you fill it with whatever you want to fill it with, rock, in this case, oyster shell. So it's very, very easy to use, very easy to mobilize, easy to assemble, and then you just fill it with wheelbarrows. So we wanted to test this also. So one of our challenges was COVID, of course, hit. And we had to come up with a way to socially distance, but also fill close to 400 bags with oyster shell. So we came up with a bagging system at Brunswick Public Works with a bunch of volunteers, where we built these bagging stations. A little tiny tractor was used to put oyster shell into these. You could sort out, dirt and stuff off the top of this, fill each tube, and then there's a bag underneath. And then we set up sewing stations, and everybody had their own station, and we sewed these bags by hand. It took a lot of time, but we did 400 bags in about 3.5 days. So again, our goals are to look at these synthetic and biodegradable mixes on small treatments. So this is our design that our engineer at GEI came up with for Wharton Point. On the left-hand side is where that log is located. This would be where the textile bags that are filled with oyster shell would be placed and staked. And to the right of that is where the georeefs would be placed and filled with oyster shell. For the McQuaid Bay Conservation Land site, we didn't have any logs there, but we had trees that we brought into the site. And what we wanted to do again was test a synthetic, this is on your left-hand side, the georeefs, versus a biodegradable product, but we integrated what we call tree runners. These are 10 to 12-foot logs that we put perpendicular to the shoreline that are meant to break up ice as those ice rafts come in towards the installation. So this is what it looked like when we were integrating the trees into Wharton Point and McCoy Bay conservation lands. On the left is Wharton Point and the right is MBCL. At MBCL, we had to float these logs in at high tide, lash them at the top, and then let them fall, and then lash them in at the bottom. And all this was done with volunteers at both sites. One of the challenges we encountered was, this was an interesting one, was what I'll call a, quote, dirty oyster shell. This oyster shell, we actually didn't have enough in Maine at the time. We don't have a recycling program in Maine. We do now. But we needed a lot of oyster shell, about 40 cubic yards. So we worked with the University of New Hampshire to get oyster shell from their one of their facilities where they have aged oyster shell. They have a recycling program where restaurants literally donate their shell, and then that shell is aged for a period of time, in this case, about 3 years, on an organic farm. So this is what that shell looked like. What was interesting was this shell was brought to Wharton Point. It was actually aged at the town of Brunswick for another year. And then we brought it to Wharton Point and dumped it. The shell fishermen started just digging around in there, and they saw organics, they saw plastic forks. So immediately this created kind of like this red flag of, you're going to be putting that into our McCoy Bay. So we had to come up with a solution on the fly to deal with that problem. And this is something that other folks who might be looking to use shell might have to encounter and have to come up with a solution for. So working with Brunswick and IFNW, we developed this screening system on site where you dump the shell through the screen, get out all the bad stuff underneath, pick out all the plastic, it goes into these baskets. The fire department came, filled up a big tub, and then we dipped each one to rinse it off. Okay, so that's how we created clean shell on site. Another challenge was doing all this work with volunteers while trying to work around tides. So we had to bring in logs at high tide. So we have a volunteer gentleman from Smith Boatyard actually donated his barge, brought the logs over by barge at high tide. We put them in place at high tide. And then we worked with the town of Brunswick's airboat to be able to shuttle materials back and forth to the MBCL site throughout all the tides. So we could actually work during low tide. Otherwise, we'd have to be hiking 20 minutes on a trail with all this stuff. It just wouldn't have made sense. So this is what the installations kind of look like. We assembled the georeef, filled it with shell, and staked it in place. It creates this beautiful rectangular reef-like material. It's highly, highly resistant. It actually will tear up your hands if you're not wearing gloves. And this is the placement of the biodegradable bags at the Wharton Point site, and they're staked in place and covered with some coir fabric. At McCoy Bay Conservation Lands, again, we floated the logs in at high tide and lashed them at the top. Then we put the georeefs underneath. They do not want to be in a trapezoidal shape or a triangular shape. They want to be in that rectangular shape. That was very hard to do. We filled it with shell and then put the bags in place as well. This is what the finishing products look like from the air for Wharton Point. This is from Rick Harbison at GP Cog. You've got your biodegradable installation, your synthetic installation, and then synthetic, biodegradable. We actually tucked bags up in here because because we couldn't get the georeefs to extend to their full height. We had to make up for that by putting bags up on top. So our last site was this Lanes Island site in Yarmouth. Again, it's a 10 to 12 foot eroding bluff, very, very dynamic. There's basically living shorelines there. There's a beach, there's a coastal wetland out front, and these seem to be there all the time. So this bluff is shedding sediment onto the beach to maintain this beach and this coastal wetland. We wanted to see if we could slow down that erosion, but still allow for sediment to go out to the intertidal zone. Working on an island is not an inexpensive proposition, and you can't necessarily do it with volunteers. We had to hire contractors to do this work. The installation here was very different. We call this a stepped crib approach. So basically, fallen trees were beneficially reused to create 1, 2, 3 steps, excuse me, and then root balls, which are kind of cut, the ends of the cut trees were put in that first step, along with on the sides to help mitigate for end effect erosion. And then all the material from regrading the bluff was placed in these steps and in front. This is kind of what this looks like from a plan view. You can see each step created is then planted with native vegetation, less salt tolerant as you go up the slope. And then excess material is placed at the toe to create sacrificial material, and then in each step. The idea is if a step fails, that material will then be released to the intertidal zone. So this is what construction looked like at Lanes. So you've got pre-construction. These are all from a game camera with these two top images that we had in place. This is during construction. There's a tractor working at just above the tide level on rafts. And it's taking these trees and driving them vertically and putting them in horizontally to create the steps. And this is planting those steps at the end. Informational signs were placed at each site. I created these kind of like using PowerPoint and Coastal Program, working with a supplier to create these beautiful signs. I think they're really nice signs, summarizing kind of what's going on the site. So if people see these, see these installations, they have a little bit more explanation and where they can go to get more information. So how have these fared? This is an aerial image that Rick shot post-construction at Lanes Island. This is the Lanes Island site. You can see it's 50 feet along a huge extent of eroding bluff. But see how well it's tucked into the bluff? It looks really, really pretty, tucked onto the face of the bluff. I think this is a promising approach. But as you'll see in my subsequent slides, this might not be the right approach for something so dynamic. So first of all, at Wharton Point. So this construction was finished at the end of May 2020 at Wharton Point. We've seen some minor, this picture is from December, some minor settlement of the georeef here, but in general, that looks great. The shell that we put behind it is still there. A little bit of it has come out. We've had some bags, about 8 shell bags, which have been knocked out since May. They need to be replaced. The bags were restaked and retwined once already, so we have to put some more bags in once we get a good window of weather and then get them back in place. There's been minor sedimentation. You can see the green algae growing on the bags. And high tide line rack is collecting on the bags when the tide doesn't go up and over. So far it's been somewhat resistant. My corgi here is he was helping me do a site visit and do some maintenance on the site. So pretty easy to maintain if you think about it. At McCoy Bay Conservation Lands, it's done very, very well. There's only been about 3 bags that have been moved or broken in all the storms that we've had since May of 2020. Some minor twisting and settling of the logs. Bags were staked and restaked once, and I'd say this has been very storm resistant so far. Now, Lanes Island has been a different story. These are images just to give you a sense of what this site looks like from our game camera. This is mounted on a tree, and it takes an image about every half hour. I'm going to go through just a couple of images with you to show you how this site has changed over the months up until the end of November. That's the last time I was able to get out there. So this is early September. This is post-construction. By the end of the month, you can see vegetation growing in, dune grass down here, other grasses and shrubs starting to come in up here, some loss of sediment at the toe. That's not unexpected. End of October, somebody stopped on their kayak paddle and had lunch on our installation. It's still looking pretty well. You can see everything has kind of really filled out in here. The beach is a little bit lower. You can see I mean, different tides, but you can see the beach is a little bit higher here than it is in this image. And then let's fast forward to November 16th. We had a super big southeaster event. Remember, this site faces due south. 35 to 45 mile an hour winds, waves, and 2 tidal cycles greater than 12 feet. It eroded all the way back to the second step and is undermining the second step at this point. I don't know what the southeaster that happened at the end of November did, and what about the current nor'easter we're having right now with high water levels. So this site is proving to be very challenging. Just to give you an idea of the changes that are occurring at this site, we did a survey of the highest annual tide line. Basically, it's at the edge of the bluff and at the edge of the coastal dune on this section of Lanes Island in October and then November post-storm. And this is the loss that has occurred: 8 to 12 feet, 6 to 10 feet, 2 to 4 feet, and 4 to 6 feet in the vicinity of the installation. So very, very dynamic. So to kind of summate Lanes Island, we've been unable to visit the site since the mid-November, so we don't know what's happened since then. But these are some images kind of giving you an idea of what's happened to the site. So we've had loss of sediment and plantings in the first step. We've lost our game camera tree. It literally fell down off the bluff. So our change rate is actually exceeding the planned monitoring that we had in place. So moving forward, we have to decide, what do we do here? Do we do nothing? Do we just keep monitoring and see what happens? Do we maintain it to its original design? Do we adapt this design somehow? Or do we remove it? All stuff we'll have to figure out. My final couple slides, some initial lessons learned from these. There were no biodegradable options for something that would survive Maine winters. We may have found that, but we don't know yet because we're just getting into winter with the bags. The things we did with bags and georeefs, volunteer labor could easily be used for that. Something like Lanes Island needs heavy equipment. You don't want volunteers doing something like that. Our project team had to be very adaptable to deal with COVID, to deal with tides, to deal with cleaning shell, and then finding funding for and constructing Lanes Island was a challenge. Messaging is key to avoid project challenges with stakeholders. For instance, if we had slightly different messaging with shell fishermen who were informed of these projects throughout the months that these projects were being developed, maybe we would have been able to quell the dirty oyster shell in the beginning instead of having to adapt in the fly. So when you're building these things and designing them, you need to be adaptable. At Lanes Island, these next 3 points really, I think, go to Lanes Island. We had a lack of historical shoreline change information at Lanes Island. That certainly probably influenced the siting of the treatment. So I think citing of these things is imperative to their success. So my low to low, moderately acceptable ranking in the MGS tool might not necessarily be appropriate for a site like Lanes Island. So we have to use in-depth site-specific information when we make these decisions. We also learned that when you're building a demonstration treatment, make access easy. Don't choose something that's really hard to get to. It just makes things more difficult and more expensive. Our monitoring frequency, especially at something like Lanes Island, was not geared towards something so dynamic. We were going to be visiting it spring, summer, and fall, and maybe once after a storm. It's like we have to be out there almost every 2 weeks based on what's going on. Scale is important. Remember, these are small 50-foot treatments, and they may not be appropriate for determining the efficacy along really long lengths of shoreline. Dynamic sites like Lanes Island might not be the best sites for living shoreline treatments that attempt to stabilize the shoreline. It might make sense to have something that breaks up some wave energy and maintains like a natural beach or a natural coastal wetland. And regular maintenance needs to be expected with these things. So with that, I want to thank all of our partners and special thanks to the organizations that have donated time, money, and effort to this. And that's what I've got for you. Thanks. I'll stop sharing my screen now.